Welcome back to our live stream series, Where is God? Here at this YouTube channel. My name is ryanenser. This is my channel, and I appreciate you coming out tonight to be here. Um, we're going to be talking about a subject tonight. I entitled it A Bad Hand, and I'll put a question mark there because we're going to discuss a bad hand and that expression and how we should think of subjects related to that, problems in our lives and suffering. So just hope that it's a blessing for you. And I'd like to start with a song tonight to get us thinking about God and worshiping. So this song's called Your Grace is Enough. And you can join right in. Think of yourself tonight as a participant, somebody who is part of the discussion, somebody who's asking questions, somebody who's commenting. It's really something that, of course, I'd like to present some information to you, but I also would like you to also be interactive and help us all learn from each other. So here's this song. It's called Your Grace is Enough. Great is your faithfulness. Well, all right. I hope that was a blessing for you. That song about your grace is enough, meaning that what God thinks of us, His favor toward us. That's what grace is. His undeserved favor toward us. That's enough for us to feel confident in ourselves and to have salvation through His Son Jesus Christ. I'd like to pray real quick, and then we'll get into our discussion about our subject, a bad hand. Lord God, thank you so much for this time to come together virtually here through this live stream and worship you a bit and continue to think about you and consider what your word has to say to us. Lord, we want to grow in our relationship with you, and we want to imitate your Son, Jesus Christ. Thank you for him. In his name, amen. All right, guys, I'm really happy to see some people on here. I see Mike Lynch and John Sherholz, Jonathan Robertson, John Schultz, and Dana Reimer. Great to see you. I know there's some people who haven't said anything. If you want to just say hi, you can just say hi right there and join in. Our subject tonight is a bad hand, and I wanted to start it off talking about the case of when someone is dealt a bad hand and what we say usually for that. Take a look. Here's our title, episode 5, A Bad Hand. You'll see the cards on the table. And when we say that, we usually are talking about someone who goes through something they did not deserve. So take a look at our question. It says here, have you met anyone who has gone through suffering that they did not deserve? Now, of course, it could be yourself. It could be someone else. Just mention if you have met people like this. You could say yes, or you could say that you have someone, in mind that you want to mention a little detail maybe about what it was that they went through. But it's something that they didn't deserve. So they're going through a problem. They're going through pain. They're going through suffering of some sort. And it's something that they did not bring upon themselves. That's what we're going to start talking about a little bit here. I see David Barnes is there. Nice to see you, David. And if you want to just say yes, go right ahead and say yes, or no if you haven't met people like this. If you have met people who have gone through suffering that they did not deserve and you want to mention a little detail about it, that'd be fine as well. I see here John Sherholz is saying that yes, he has met people like this, and he says that it even seems like they live under a dark cloud, like there's sort of suffering coming to them often, I think is what he's getting at. And I do believe there are people like that. You sort of notice that many difficulties have come their way, and it's hard for them to seem to escape it. I definitely agree with that. I think that, when you're thinking of somebody who has something come their way that they did not deserve, I mean, you're thinking of a child that has all of a sudden has cancer, and you wonder, did that person do something to get that? I mean, usually the answer is no, no way. I mean, how could that happen to them? And why is that happening? We ask a lot of questions. I see John Schultz says here that on Easter Sunday, his daughter and his dog were attacked by a pit bull, and boy, they really didn't think that was something they deserved. Like it wasn't something they did an action to get that consequence. They had it out of the blue in a way for him, I think. We have Jonathan Robertson mentioning about this teacher that was hit by a truck on East River Road. Well, on Grand Island, right here in our town, for anybody that doesn't know about the situation, there was, this lady was just walking on the street and hit almost, you could say, randomly or without any fault on her part that we know about. So, most people think that's a story where, somebody was hurt or in pain undeservingly. With cancer, as Jonathan Roberts has said, that's kind of what I had in mind as well. Somebody with cancer, you wonder, what did they do to deserve that? And there are people that are trying to find connections between what you do and what, health-wise, what your consequences are. But a lot of illnesses people get are not caused by something they do. I see also here another case of a car accident. A girl was hit by a car walking with a friend. So, I mean, how can that be something that is going on? This is our idea of, suffering and pain coming to somebody who did not deserve it. Now, the phrase we say, a lot of times we say that person was dealt a bad hand. And that's why I entitled the message that a bad hand. Like, what is it that we try to explain there? Well, we're trying to explain that the person didn't do something to themselves. It was like an outside force had done it to them. And I wanted to mention to you somebody who I have studied a bit, and his name is David Brainerd. He's a Christian man from the 1700s in America, colonial Connecticut. Now, the reason why his story is memorable is not just because he had some pain and suffering, but because he was around historically a time when there were some important people and some important events happening that David Brainerd's story was preserved. And the important person that preserved his story was Jonathan Edwards, who, if you haven't looked into him yet, you could always check out a lot of books that are out of print that, would be free to look into Jonathan Edwards. David Brainerd, when he was a child, was he was left alone because his both parents were ill, and their illnesses led to premature deaths when he was still a young boy. Now, after that, he went to live at his sister's. His sister took him in. He had an older sister, so he lived there at his older sister's. Well, he had a difficult childhood, obviously, without parents to love and comfort him and take care of him. Well, he went on to Yale because at that time, Yale was the school you'd go to if you wanted to become a minister. So he went to Yale thinking he's going to be a minister. Well, early on at Yale, he contracted an illness that they describe the symptoms of, but at the time they didn't have a name for. The illness was described as he was spitting up blood. That's what they said was one of the signs, the symptoms of what he had. And it turned out most people today think it was tuberculosis is what David Brainerd had. Well, he contracted tuberculosis not because of a fault of his own. I mean, he pretty much, like other illnesses, was, it was contracted, it was kind of sort of accidentally. Well, he served as a missionary anyway to American Indians near the Connecticut colony for about 7 years until it became too difficult for him to continue. So he came back, and where did he stay? Well, he stayed at Jonathan Edwards' house, and that's why we have this information on David Brainerd, because of David Brainerd's own journal and Jonathan Edwards' writings. Well, he died at 29 years old in Jonathan Edwards' house, being taken care of by Jonathan Edwards' daughter, which I will mention, his daughter that took care of David, she died a year later of tuberculosis as well. So you see things happening that you sort of say, I don't know if this is, how this is happening. It's like somebody was dealt a bad hand. I do want to say that this book about David Brainerd is a free ebook from Desiring God Ministries. I'll put it in the description below when you see this video posted to the YouTube site, and you can take a look at that book and download it for your information. So was David Brainerd dealt a bad hand? Are others that are suffering because of even things they did not even cause for themselves dealt a bad hand? That's really our question. And, our main point I want to show you here, our key idea tonight is when we're talking about where is God, we've got to realize, and we're going to be looking into this a lot more, that God connects closely with us in times of suffering. This is a very important time to be able to connect with God when you're suffering in some way. And I think that right now there are many people suffering in different ways. So I wanted this message to be something that would connect with you. If you feel that you're in a situation where you're suffering, I want this to be an encouragement to you that by the end of it, I think you're going to realize that there's so much richness that comes during this time in our relationship with God during a time of suffering. So I want to ask a question here about when we're hearing about someone who's having a problem. This is my suspicion. My suspicion is that a lot of us, we try to figure out how they got into the problem. So you hear about somebody at work has a problem with their, a check in their bank account. They had a problem with a transaction, or maybe somebody at work or around the family. You hear about somebody just got this health diagnosis, and you think there's got to be some way that they did something to themselves to do that. And that's kind of like that backstory, looking for the backstory on that. And I wanted to know if that's something you run into as well, because I feel like it's something that you see commonly. You'll hear about a problem with somebody, and you think, how can I figure out what it is that they did to bring that problem on themselves? Maybe you can say, if you experienced this, you could say yes. You could say yes, that this is something you experienced. Just type in a yes, or you could even mention a little story if you wanted to mention a little bit about it. But I feel like it's a pretty common thing. So if you notice, it's also happening around you, where people are looking for the reason that the suffering came to a person. Then just mention that you hear, see that, or hear, experience that. You could type in yes, or give me like a thumbs up if you're on your phone. Maybe use your emojis. Because I feel like it is common to find how we can blame somebody for their amount of pain and amount of problems that they're dealing with. And this isn't that different from what happened in the Bible. And so that's where I wanted to go with this. I see John Sherrills is mentioning about karma. The idea of karma, my wife's from India. We go to India a lot. That idea of you are going to get the consequences of your actions either in the near term or the long term is a pretty important idea for them. And we say it around here. We say what comes around goes around. That's our way of talking about karma. If you do this, you're going to have this consequence. And that's what we try to say, that there's some kind of like invisible force that's making everybody reckoning with their actions. I think the Bible doesn't really say that there is karma, but I know that bringing that idea up, it is a common thing people think. And I think also here I see Dana saying sometimes yes and sometimes no. People are looking for that reason, that way to blame somebody for their problems. Well, in Luke 13, I wanted you to go to Luke 13 if you have your Bibles. Otherwise, you can listen to the story. In Luke 13, at the beginning of the chapter, there were some religious people asking Jesus about the victims of a disaster that happened in Jerusalem. So a tower fell onto these people who were standing near it, and 30-some people were killed at that time. Nice to see you, Vinay. That's actually my father-in-law, Vinay Mangalwadi, seeing us from India. Happy to have you on here. I want to mention that in Luke 13, when the story that Jesus responded to, the people said, this tower fell on these people and the people died. Well, what did those people do to deserve the tower falling on them? See, they were looking for, how do I find a way to blame a person for what happened to them? So they were thinking of, if something bad happens to you, there must be some way that you've caused it to happen to yourself. But Jesus right away said that, no, this is not something that they did on their own. And he says that the same thing will happen to you that happened to them. in this world, because so many of us are facing different problems and pain, and it's not really that we're doing something to earn it, to find the blame and the fault on ourselves. And so Jesus' message after that short story is about how suffering is not always the fault of the victim. You can have suffering that you caused to yourself, but there's also suffering that happens that you didn't cause to yourself. And I think it's an important lesson about suffering. And when you think about, a bad hand, you wonder if, did somebody just have something accidentally happen to them, or are they causing it? Well, we know from Jesus that suffering is not always the fault of the victim. Well, beyond that, if you go further down in Luke chapter 13, you'll see that Jesus also came across a woman who was bent over. You could say she had some kind of scoliosis, is what we would probably say today. At that time, they said that she had a disability from a spirit, a disabling spirit had afflicted her in the back, and that she was bent over, could not stand up. Well, the way that she couldn't stand up, in the amount of years, Jesus came in and he healed her at that exact time. Well, the healing that he did was a way for him to demonstrate that this suffering was caused by Satan. And now I'm going to relieve this woman of the suffering that's caused by Satan. He was trying to teach us that Satan causes suffering. So we have to understand that suffering is not always a fault of our own, and that suffering is caused by Satan. These are two important messages. And the New Testament also shares a little bit more about why we have suffering with Paul. Paul uses mentions about suffering in Romans 8:20 especially. So if you're going there, Romans 8:20, Paul says that the creation was subjected to futility. You see, when sin came into the world, it wasn't just the people that sinned that were affected. There was a consequence for all of the creation, and that consequence is that there is sort of a suffering, a pain, problems that happen to all of the creation as a general consequence of sin. It's not one thing that someone has done to create this problem. It's all of that's caused by sin, all the consequences. And you could say it's like a general consequence of sin. So we hear about why we have suffering for these reasons in the New Testament. And there's even more passages. So if you're interested in this subject, there's a lot to learn from the New Testament about it. So let me just sum up real quick what we talked about with the reasons for suffering, so you can see it on the screen there. You've got, number one, not always the fault of the victim. All right, suffering is not always the fault of the victim. Number two, suffering is caused by Satan. That's one where Jesus pointed out with the lady that was bent over. And also the third one, suffering is a consequence of sin. You see this when Paul's talking about how the creation was subject to futility. So this is our basic understanding of why we have suffering here. Where does suffering come from? But beyond that, I want to get into a little bit more of the purpose. And getting into the purpose, I want to ask you a question about how you would describe your feelings toward a situation of suffering. So take a look at your screen there. It says, what word would you use to describe how you feel about suffering you face? So if you could just use one word and describe the feeling that comes over you. How do you feel when you're in a case of suffering? So maybe you have an illness that comes along. Maybe you have some difficulties in your home. Things are breaking. Maybe you have difficulties with your car. These are different types of pain and problems that we deal with. And what I'm wondering is, what word would you describe how you feel at that time? I want to see how people deal with this and what they say they feel like. So you can just type the one word as you're commenting there that you think describes best how you feel when you have to face suffering. I know that one word that I use to describe suffering would be the feeling I'd say is just what I just saw come up here. There's two of them saying frustrated. That was the word that I thought of, frustrated. That would be about the first word that I would think of. And so I see Mike Lynch says here about frustration. Suffering can be used to grow us, change us, or let us draw closer to God and not try to rely on our own strength and wisdom. I see Ron Wilson said frustrated as well. And John Schultz is saying question, like he's not sure why, or he's wondering about his situation with a question. I think with suffering, I would also say anger. Anger could be another one. You know, you're angry that this thing has come your way, and that especially when you look at someone else and you say, well, they don't have to deal with it, and look at me, I'm dealing with it. I think this is where we can get angry. The frustration can be at another level. I see Jonathan Robertson. He's asking the question, really, with question marks, like this has really happened to me. And yeah, that's real life. That when suffering comes our way and pain and difficulty, we think, this is really happening. Like, I can't believe this. And John Schultz is saying he wants to know why the Father allowed it. Like, how can this be happening? Why me? And these are great questions, I think, that describe just how you feel when you're in a situation when you're suffering. And, it's like, think about how when you get very sick, maybe you have some kind of illness where you're in pain to the point where you really can't enjoy small things. Let's say you want to have your favorite ice cream and you realize, you can't stop thinking of the pain that you're experiencing. So you end up not even being able to enjoy your ice cream. Some things I think when I come up with thinking about suffering and the way you feel, I think you feel like you're losing out on progress. Like you want to go forward, but you're dealing with a problem. So now you can't really go forward. Maybe you're fixing something, washing machine, and you just keep working on it and does not seem to work. You feel like I need to be doing something else and moving forward, but I can't because I have this other thing I'm dealing with. I think this is another situation we can be in. I see Vinay saying lonely. Suffering does isolate us. It does make us feel like we're separate from others and different from them. I definitely agree with that. I wanted to share about Paul's approach to suffering here because in Philippians 3:10-11, we see another way of looking at suffering that helps us to understand the biblical approach, and I think will help us inform our approach when we experience suffering again. It says here in Philippians 3, verse 10, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, and may share his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, that by any means possible I may attain the resurrection from the dead. You'll see there Philippians 3:10-11. And what this verse really points out to us is that we share in the sufferings of Christ. And I think that sharing in the suffering of Christ is an amazing thing to think about. When you think of Jesus Christ, I think many of us think of him, he's God on earth. He's not like us. He is so different. He's otherworldly. He's not living a life that's similar to us. I think most of us think like that when we think of Jesus. He's not really that similar to us, I think is how we think a lot of times. Well, when we find a verse like Philippians 3:10-11 here, talking about how we share in the sufferings of Christ, it's putting us in an experience that we could say is almost equal, is about the same. And imagine that we're able to share, we're able to do something that's just like what he did. When we suffer, it's just like what he was doing when he suffered. It's really not that different. And the amount of connection that comes from that between us and Christ is amazing. It's to such a level. And I think that, when we are thinking about our suffering, our problems, sometimes I think we miss that there's a great chance for a close connection with Jesus Christ at that time that does not really happen very often during the good times when we're not involved in some kind of pain or suffering. Because during the good times, it's not that much like Jesus Christ. See, his life was a life of suffering. He was a man of sorrows, as the Bible says. So when you're close to Christ, it's because your life is like his. And when your life has suffering, it's a lot like his. And so you get to reap the benefits of a connection, a close connection with Jesus Christ during that time. So I want to encourage you, if you're going through difficulties now, or if they come again soon, that the connection with Jesus Christ is really something you can take advantage of during suffering, because he was a man who suffered, and then we can join and we can share in those sufferings together. So I definitely wanted to point that out, that sharing with the sufferings is so important. And we're asking ourselves in this whole series, where is God? Well, we've got to know that God is with us in suffering. He's with us even more than normal, even more than regular situations when it comes to suffering. So we can see now that the purpose of suffering so far is to closely connect with Jesus Christ. You can see in Philippians that that's one of the things that suffering does for us. It's to connect us to him closely. I wanted to share another question I thought about when we're talking about this subject. And I think that some of us think of learning things the hard way as a way of talking about how we can benefit from difficulties. And so my question here is, what are some things that we learn by going through suffering? So anything you can contribute about what are some things that we learn by going through suffering? You can type in a word or a phrase in the chat. The idea here is that there's something about suffering that we kind of know it's helpful for us. That's, I think, why we have this phrase in English where we say we're learning things the hard way, because we sort of have an intuition that there's something to be gained from difficult situations. But it's not always something we want to talk about, because we don't want to be some kind of person who is thinking about, pessimism or how bad things are all the time. But I think that we do know innately a little bit that there's something beneficial to suffering for us. And I see here Ron Wilson is saying that we have perseverance and dependence comes from suffering. These are great words talking about perseverance in our walk with God, dependence on Jesus Christ. I see John Sherholt's sufferings helps us reprioritize our lives, changing what is important to us, identifying what really matters. That's great. Thanks for sharing. John Schultz about relying on him. Also here, having empathy for others from John Sherholtz. Being able to connect with someone else in their time of need, in their difficulty, a lot of it depends on if we have experienced something difficult. Because unless we've been there in some way, something like what someone's dealing with, it's very difficult for us to join them in our emotions, in our hearts, empathizing. So I do think that that's a very important point. Dana Reimer saying about how others felt, like you start to realize what others feel like. And I see Mike Lynch here, that God is in control and we are not. Something you learn from suffering. God is in control, we are not. I think that's a good point. Some of us start to think that when things are going well, we're sort of doing well on our own, that we don't really need help from anyone or God. So I think that's a good point. Even he says maybe that we need to make a change in our life, or maybe we need to be the light in it to let others see that we trust God. So there's, I think, some good points to be made here about some things we learn through suffering. And I wanted to point you to Hebrews chapter 5, thinking about a verse that it's actually telling us what Jesus learned. And I think you'll be surprised when you look at this verse. So Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8, I'll put it on the screen here, says, although he was a son, we're talking about Jesus here, although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And I had on the screen there 5, 8 to 10. Actually, 8 to 10 is a good section, but I could only really fit verse 8 up there. So we're looking at Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. So what did Jesus learn in his suffering? He learned obedience to his Father. And this is something that I think that is very interesting when you think about Jesus. Like we talked earlier, a lot of us think of him as such an amazing, such a different, otherworldly kind of person that we couldn't be like him that much. I think that a lot of us thinking about him as God in the flesh, the God part makes us think he can't relate that closely with us. But you see here that the God-man himself had to learn something. He learned from suffering. And you think that what was Jesus lacking that he would have to learn? Well, in this case, he needed to learn this. And this is something that God the Father had taught him through suffering. And the interesting thing is that he learned obedience. So what does that mean? Well, when Jesus was going to the cross and going to be arrested and going into all of the end events of his life, he really was in control in a way that we're not. So what he said was, I lay my life down. No one takes it from me. So he was emphasizing that he is in control differently than us. I mean, if somebody, if the police come to arrest us, we can't just say, no, you're not going to arrest me now. in Jesus' case, he was still an all-powerful God. So he was able to do it. Now, did he do it? No. He actually did lay down his life. He did not prevent anyone from taking his life. All right. He allowed the police to come to arrest him, the soldiers that is at the time, and to be executed. Well, he went through all of that, never saying no. He continually said yes to God's plan of having him crucified to save mankind from their sins. So when he's going through all this, he's obeying. You see, saying yes to God's plan. The will of God was to crush him, we see in Isaiah 53. See, the plan here going forward, Jesus never said no to. He was always obedient to the entire plan. At any point, he could have chosen to not go the way of the plan, which would have been disobeying his Father. And as we know, he never did disobey his Father. He never sinned. But we have this problem, right? We have this problem of not obeying our Father. So Christ learned obedience by doing it. You see, he didn't already have the obedience before doing it. The way that the verse says in Hebrews, he learned obedience from going through those difficult times of suffering and maintaining his decision to continue to do his Father's will and to not stop doing his Father's will, to not turn to his own interest. He had said when he was on the night of his arrest, you may remember, he was sorrowful to death. And I think he's trying to express such nervousness. He's thinking about what's going to happen. He has anxiety about the death that's coming. And not just any death, but a brutal death. And a death that at our church we've been talking about that had been perfected for years, hundreds of years with the Persians, and then brought into the Middle East, to the Romans, started to use it as well. And so Jesus, knowing this is coming, he's feeling anxious. You can tell that the way that he had to suffer is something he didn't want to do. Well, even more, beyond that, you've got to realize he was tempted. So I think if you think about what was Jesus tempted to do during the time of his arrest, his torture, his execution, well, he was tempted to stop it. He was tempted to say, no, I'm not going to go through with this anymore. It's too painful. I don't want to do this. I have something else I want to do. I mean, anything but to have all these things happen to him. So when you're thinking of Jesus Christ learning obedience through suffering, I think it's really an amazing situation that the Savior of the world, God man, also had to learn obedience. And that's our lesson. Our lesson is that we need to learn obedience as well. So when we go through suffering, I think there's a lot of points that you guys have made about how it is when we go through suffering, what it's like, what we can learn. And I think that from Hebrews, one thing that we can learn is that we need to learn obedience through suffering. You see, we need to continue to do God's will, even though we're suffering. And one of the things that I feel like is very tempting for me, you may feel the same way. If you feel the same way, definitely send a message here. One of the things that I noticed when I go through a difficult time is that I want to complain about it and become frustrated, angry, all those things we talked about. And I'm really lashing out at God. I'm saying, God, how could you let this happen? How could you put me through this? And I'm actually starting to get into a disobedience. I'm getting into a resisting of what God has for me because I'm really setting myself up against him because the circumstances are not favorable for me. So I think that you may go through something like this as well. And if you do, I want to encourage you that our goal is to, as the suffering comes to us, to do better and better at staying the course in our relationship with God, doing his will and not our own will. This is definitely an important lesson for us. And so if we look at the two different purposes for suffering we talked about so far, we talked about that the purpose of suffering is to closely connect with Jesus Christ. And we also talked about how the purpose of suffering is to learn obedience to God, the Father. You see, we learn obedience by doing the right thing, obeying, but we also learn obedience by making mistakes and disobeying and then being corrected. See, we know this because we grew up with parents who had to correct us. And we disobey, we're corrected. We disobey, we're corrected. Now, Jesus learned obedience the way that only is through doing the right thing and obeying consistently. So Jesus was able to obey. In our case, we struggle with obeying and disobeying. So we continue to learn obedience, and we go through correction. So you can see here the purpose of suffering, connecting closely with Jesus Christ and learning obedience to God the Father. So I encourage you, as you're going through these situations now, and it may be coming for you. I don't want to be a person who predicts, ominous cases, but with the current situation, with the health emergency, with the economic emergency, I don't know what kind of suffering is going to come to different people. And I wanted to have this message share with you so that you can think about what it is, like a frame for suffering. Like, how do I understand suffering? So sharing about why we have suffering and how Jesus spoke about that, and also the purpose of suffering, I think will give us a context, an understanding, an approach when we have to deal with things. I want to mention here a couple people that typed in. I see Vinay here says, many times my earthly father, in order to discipline me, made me suffer. And this is what he's talking about here, correction. We disobey and we're corrected. And that's my father-in-law saying that he was corrected, by his father, and I was corrected by my father. And our Heavenly Father, He is correcting us too. You'll find in the book of Hebrews, it does discuss, if you're a son, you're going to be disciplined. You're going to be corrected by your father. It's in another place, not the verses we looked at today. Also, Jonathan Roberts is saying from Romans 5:3-5 that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So you see that there's a chain of different benefits that come to us from suffering. And that's another place you could look, Romans chapter 5, verses 3-5 there. So let me just review quickly about what we talked about with our reasons for suffering and our purposes for suffering. So take a look here. The reasons for suffering that we talked about, especially from Luke 3 and Romans 8, was that suffering is not always the fault of the victim. It's tempting for us to try to find that blame, but it's not always the fault of the victim. Suffering is caused by Satan. He's active in the world causing problems. And number 3 here, suffering is a consequence of sin. The sin that is generally in the world causes suffering, even if it's not your particular sin that causes it. It's the consequence of sin existing in our world. And also for the purpose of suffering, take a look here. The purpose of suffering, which the Bible spends more time talking about, and that's why we spent a little while talking about it tonight. The purpose of suffering is, number 1, closely connecting with Jesus Christ. And the second one, learn obedience to God the Father. Those are the 2 purposes. Closely connecting with Jesus Christ, sharing the experience, sharing the suffering with Jesus. And then the second one about learning obedience to God, that we learn, just like Jesus did, learn to obey our Father better through suffering and trying to fight the inclination to disobey. And so these are our messages for tonight about the reasons and the purposes. So I'm really happy that I was able to be here with you for this message. Thinking about where is God, we've got to realize that God is with us in suffering, and He's with us even closer than just a regular experience. So I hope that's encouraging to you, and I look forward to any comments or questions you have later. You can always put them in the video comments below the video when it's posted. I'm also posting other videos. You'll see that just deal with the subject itself. Just me telling you for 10 minutes about that subject instead of the interactive part, the live stream. It's I call it the podcast style because it's just me talking, and you can find that video as well on the same YouTube channel. So thanks again for being here, and stay safe. God bless.